All right. We covered most of the New Testament so far. Today we'll take a look at 1st and 2nd Peter, and then we'll take a look at the letter of Jude, and then we'll go on to the book of Hebrews. This is a little bit different kind of literature. There are questions in the past about whether Peter was the one, the disciple of Jesus, who wrote these letters. You can look at all of the information about that in other sources, different commentaries. There is no good alternative to talking about these letters as being from Peter. And so my assumption is that these letters are from Peter, just as the early church told us, and just as the documents themselves tell us. These come from Peter, who was Jesus' disciple, sort of one of the spokespersons of the disciples at Pentecost, and certainly a strong leader of Jesus' church from early on. What happens to be the case at this point is that Peter was by this time in Rome. Paul was in Rome from about 57 to 59 AD. It seems like when he went to Rome, Peter was probably not there yet. So Peter probably got to Rome sometime in the late 50s. He would be there for less than a decade because Nero was the emperor at that time. Nero came to power in 58 AD, and Nero would begin the process, or 54 AD, I'm sorry. Nero became the emperor in 54 AD, and a decade later, in 64 AD, he would begin his direct persecutions of the Christians. That would lead to Peter's martyrdom, probably sometime in late 64 or early 65. Peter would eventually be crucified in a place that was a garbage dump and a swamp. They called it the Vatican, which is why the Vatican exists where it is today. That is the place of execution outside the ancient walls of Rome, and that became a holy spot for early Christians. And upon that dump and that execution site, the place we now know as the Vatican was built. That's why St. Peter's Basilica is there. But Peter moved to Rome probably sometime in the late 50s, and John Mark, the guy who wrote the gospel, seems to be accompanying him. John Mark is called by Peter, my son, not biological, of course, but my son in the faith, and his assistant and his strong helper through things. And at one point during Peter's stay in Rome, Peter was asked to give a series of public lectures. It was those lectures most likely that were the basis for the Gospel of Mark, that these are largely Peter's discourses, sermons, preaching, testimonies about Jesus and what he remembered from his time with Jesus. So the Gospel of Mark, as we've looked at before, becomes the basis or comes directly from Peter's declarations about Jesus in Rome. What happened along the way is that each of the disciples of Jesus, they were held in high esteem by the early church, and Peter certainly highest among all of them. They were often asked to come out to places where the church was just getting a start. And in the case of what we read in 1 Peter in particular, it seems like there was a series of new churches being birthed, becoming formed, a lot of new Christians coming to faith, probably most of them Jews related to the Jewish synagogues. Much of the early church began its expansion through the testimonies of Jewish people about Jesus, the Messiah, and then going to other towns and participating in Jewish worship services, synagogue services, and telling about the Messiah who had come. In any case, what we read in 1 Peter is that Peter was asked to go to Bithynia, Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia. These are regions in central, northern, and a little bit to the east or western part of Turkey today. And it seems as if Peter was asked to make a kind of swing through the new areas of the Christian church and officiate at baptisms. What we find in 1 Peter are a number of references to baptisms, and he seems to be talking to a lot of new Christians, people who have come very recently into their understanding of Jesus as Messiah. The letter itself, while it has many wonderful encouragements, also is a bit dark. It does, in fact, talk a lot about suffering. And it even begins that way. Peter writes to these people. He's likely back in Rome at this time, and now he's finished his swing of these new churches, new cities where there are new Christians. He's done a number of public baptisms in these places. There's a whole lot of new Christians, and he writes this letter to them as a letter of encouragement. But notice how it begins. Right in the first chapter, Peter talks about refining gold. Now, we have blast furnaces that create a very high temperature. They didn't have such blast furnaces in those times. It was a small-scale operation when you wanted to refine gold. Gold melts rather easily, but it's also very dense. It's very heavy. And what happens for the refining of gold is that the ore would be put in a cauldron, and the fire would be lit underneath, and then there would be a bellows that would fan the flames, because when the flames were fueled by oxygen forced upon it, the flames would get hotter. Now, what happens, according to Peter in 1 Peter, he talks about the refiner sitting there having put the ore in the cauldron and fanning the flames and then looking down into the cauldron. So that would be very hot because the gold has already melted. What would happen is that the refiner would take a stick or a spoon, probably wooden of some kind, and drag it over the surface of the kind of boiling mess of liquid in there, and dragging the impurities to the side, hopefully lifting them out. The ore would be refined and the gold would be pure when the refiner, looking down into the cauldron, could see his own face reflected back from the shiny surface of the gold. Peter uses that image to talk about these Christians being in the refiner's fire. Things are getting hot. Things are heating up. He mentions that they have not seen Jesus, so they've heard about Jesus from other people. They're second-generation Christians, but they believe in Jesus, but the times are getting tough. This is, again, as Nero is emperor and things are heating up, it could be approaching the outbreak of the violence that Nero himself would create. In any case, Christians are not the people that are well appreciated in society. Increasingly, they are being marginalized and persecuted. And the refining fire is right up there at the front. Now, that theme of being refined in the fires will continue throughout the letter. In the first couple of chapters, remember that chapters and verses are things we added to the text. They're not original there. But in what we have as the first couple of chapters, Peter builds a series of connections between the Christians of this era and the people of God in Old Testament times. Notice all of the connections. You are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, an assembly, those who stand before God. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. And Peter would know that the term, the people of God, is a term in the Old Testament for Israel. So Peter's making all of these connections between the people of God in the Old Testament and the people of God in the New Testament. Remember, I talked about the big picture of the Bible being a series of M words as I think about it. One is the mission of God. God has a problem. All the kids have left home, and God's seeking to bring all the kids home again. Second is the method. How does that happen? In the Old Testament, that happens through the nation of Israel being taught in a unique way and put in that one spot where everybody would notice them. But notice in the New Testament, that community is now scattered among the nations. I talked thirdly about the managers, and so we saw Moses, we saw Joshua, we saw the elders, we saw the judges, we saw the kings and the prophets, and now we're into the apostles. So those are the managers of this. Then came the meltdown in the Old Testament, where the Old Testament family of God, the unique partner in God's mission, seemed not to be able to sustain this effort, and they couldn't get ahead. They were shrinking, and their confidence and their ability to connect with the nations was being diminished over and over again. And that's when it came for what I call the fifth M, and that's the miracle. There was a pointing to the day of the Lord. Jesus is that day of the Lord, but Jesus does something sixthly, the mutation. Instead of bringing the day of the Lord all at one time, he expands the day of the Lord by coming not once, but twice. And we live in the intervening time, in the in-between time. And that's what Peter is writing about, that Jesus has come, salvation has been achieved, there's no more that can be done, but now people have to come and believe that. They have to participate in that. And during this time in between Jesus' first and second comings, Peter uses the term, the day of the Lord. During this time, there will be a lot of pressure to deny and to give up the faith and to stop participating in this. And so there's a lot of emphasis on the sufferings. And the way that happens in chapters 2 and 3 is that Peter then points to Jesus. And Peter talks about the sufferings of Jesus and how Jesus was faithful through the sufferings. And then chapter 2, verse 21, he has left us an example that we should follow in his steps. So we're talking here about suffering. We've got the image of the cauldron. We've got the heat of the fire going on. We've got the persecution that's happening and that's ramping up. And Jesus becomes the one who helps us understand how we can go through life, even when life brings us suffering. And the rest of the book will really focus on that. The last part of chapter 3 is really quite something. It's a chapter in which Peter uses a lot of words, heaping them up, and says some strange things that we haven't entirely sorted out in the English language. Maybe in some of the Indonesian languages or in some of the African languages, Ugandan languages, you can sort it out better than we have tried in the English language. We can't quite figure it out in the Greek language. Peter writes long sentences in which he goes on and on about how Jesus came and he preached the good news even through Noah at that time, and how he went down to the spirits that were in prison and he declared a kind of victory. And this is a long drawn out sentence, and Peter adds to this the waters of baptism, kind of pointing to the floods at Noah's time, and then the immersion of the early Christians in water, dying and coming back to life again with Jesus. It's a fascinating thing. We haven't quite got it all figured out, but there are different interpretations. And by the way, this is the one spot where we can see something happening historically. We know that the Apostles' Creed, which all of us use to testify to our faith everywhere around the world, an ecumenical creed about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And we know the Nicene Creed, which is very much like the Apostles' Creed, but is a bit longer. And the length of the Nicene Creed is increased over the Apostles' Creed primarily because there's an emphasis on Jesus' divinity as well as his humanity. In the Apostles' Creed, we get those testimonies about Jesus coming to earth, being born and living and suffering under Pontius Pilate and dying. The Nicene Creed adds other things about Jesus being God of God, very God of very God, begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father, by whom all things were made, kind of in reaction to Arius's teachings early on in the church. Now, why do I mention that? Because since the Nicene Creed is built on top of the Apostles' Creed, it would seem that all of the information in the Apostles' Creed would also be contained in the Nicene Creed. And in fact, it is, except for one thing. The Nicene Creed adds additional things about Jesus' divinity, but the Nicene Creed misses one thing which is in the Apostles' Creed. And that one thing is that short phrase in the Apostles' Creed, he descended into hell. During the Middle Ages in Europe, there was so much suffering and death, particularly with plagues and all of that, that there was a strong attachment to what happens next. And in the reflection of theologians on this passage from 1 Peter, this thing about Jesus going down in the time of Noah and preaching to those in prison and declaring things, and through baptism were related to that. What took place is that one small phrase was added to the Apostles' Creed. He descended into hell. That is based in large part on this last part of chapter 3 in 1 Peter. It is not clear entirely what that's supposed to mean or how that was accomplished. The Heidelberg Catechism, for instance, in the denominations that I love dearly, talks about Jesus suffering many things, even death itself, in order that we might not have to do that. But there is something about he descended into hell trying to figure out what happened to Jesus in between Good Friday and Easter Sunday. That we leave to the speculation of philosophers and theologians, but that is the connection, and an important connection, I think, between 1 Peter and the Apostles' Creed. Well, 1 Peter continues on in chapter 4 talking about other expressions of suffering and how to go through suffering and how to bear witness through suffering. It continues on in chapter 5 with affirmations for the elders who give good leadership to the congregations. There's also some stuff there about being aware again of the dangers of wealth and things that we should keep in mind. Be sober, be watchful, for your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walks around, prowls around, seeking whom he may devour. So all kinds of admonitions. But if we want to remember anything in particular about 1 Peter, it has to be that idea of suffering. We are beginning a new era of suffering, says Peter. You've been baptized. Congratulations. Stay true to the faith, but you're going to suffer. Keep in mind Jesus' sufferings. He suffered, and he has given us an example that we should follow in his steps. Strong encouragement through tough times, and the affirmation that all things are still in the control of God. Now, that letter was probably written sometime in the early 60s, probably 61, 62, and probably sometime shortly thereafter, maybe into 64, when Peter might have been arrested, and it could be that he was arrested by the time we have 2 Peter. He writes this other letter. It is clear from 2 Peter that he is near the end of his journey. He looks back, he talks about seeing Jesus appear on the mountain of transfiguration. He talks about the need for people to read these things and to stick with the teachings of the apostles because this generation is passing away. And then Peter turns to another topic altogether in what we call chapter 2 of 2 Peter. And there he talks about false teachers. He'll continue that on a little bit into chapter 3, but really chapter 2, false teachers, false teachers. There are many who are now invading the community of Jesus, and they're teaching things that are suspect and that are not appropriate. And Peter warns against these people, and we'll take a look at some of the warnings in a little bit further. And then Peter finally talks in chapter 3 about the end of the day of the Lord. Notice that Peter uses that term once again, and remember that the day of the Lord was that idea from the prophets of the Old Testament about when God would have to break in and once again make things right. The prophets always seeing it as a one-time deal. What we have in the New Testament through this miracle of Jesus and the mutation that Jesus gives to the day of the Lord is that Jesus splits that day of the Lord in two, and precisely because we're living in between Jesus' first coming and his second coming, we experience both the delight of knowing that God's salvation is complete and also experiencing the challenges that Jesus himself faced before Jesus comes again. And that's more what Peter talks about in 2 Peter chapter 3. He talks about a day in God's eyes being as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as a single day. time meaning being a little bit irrelevant, at least time from our perspective, but that God will finish the job God has begun, that Jesus will return, and that the fires of the day of the Lord, remember that one of the aspects of the day of the Lord was judgment, the fires of judgment would cleanse and purify this world and begin the process of the new creation. So Peter talks about that. Now, great stuff. Then we have a little bit of a problem because we have also the letter of Jude. Who is this Jude? There was one disciple. There were actually two disciples of Jesus that were known as Jude or Judas. One killed himself, of course. The other one is called Judas the Less, or the Quiet, and very little is known about him, and nothing is ever said in the early church that his name is associated with this letter. But Jesus had younger siblings. After Jesus was miraculously born to Mary, then Mary and Joseph continued to have natural family relations, and James, the one who officiated at the Jerusalem Council, Acts 15, and wrote the letter James came along. He became a strong leader in the early church. But the next boy in line was Jude or Judas. It was a common name because these were people of Judah, and they carried with them the badge of honor of their name. And that is the person that the early church has consistently said wrote this letter. Now, the problem we have is that there are so many similarities between Jude's letter and primarily 2 Peter chapter 3. And typically we think there must be a literary relationship between them because there's so many similarities, kind of like we sense the similarities between the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew. Some similarities too with the Gospel of Luke, but especially Mark and Matthew. And so we think that what happened is that either Peter made use of Jude's preliminary letter, or Jude made use of Peter's letter that was already out in public, or both of them had some other tract or source that was previously written that they both made use of. I think, and most of us think, that Peter's letter was sent probably in the early to mid-60s, and that Jude said, wow, that's a good letter, and he wanted to make use of it, and that he used Peter's second letter, especially that chunk on false teachers, and basically copied and amplified a lot of it. It doesn't make a lot of difference no matter what. The issue remains the same. But there are a lot of correlations between 2 Peter chapter 2 and the letter of Jude. And what we find are a bunch of leaders who are going into the churches and they're calling attention to themselves. They think this is a good job, a job that can earn you good money. If you're a good teacher or preacher, go for it, get the money. And they preach a gospel. They say, nobody else has the secrets. I have the secrets. God spoke to me, and here's how it's supposed to happen. And they twist it all and make it much more of a human-centered religion. They think they're pretty good, and so they get it to the head of the line when there are potluck dinners, and they take the best of the bread and the wine when there's communion. And they know that in other forms of religion that the priests in the temples can have sex with the prostitutes, and so they do that, and they then turn that over to other people. These are all things that Peter and Jude both mention. They make fun of the bread and the wine. Yeah, we're going to eat some Jesus today. You know, things like that. They really make a mess out of this and call attention to themselves as if they're the best preachers who have ever lived and have the greatest humor and all of that, and can then get paid the most for it. That seems to be part of this. Who were these teachers? Some have suggested maybe they were Gnostics. We'll look at Gnosticism next time. Some say maybe they were Ebionites from the Jewish sects who thought Jesus was a great deliverer, but maybe not divine. Some say there may be similarities with the heresy that Paul had to address in Colossae. In the end, we just don't know. All we know is that there were increasingly a number of people going out and using the development of the Christian church as a means for their own personal satisfaction and advancement and money making, and I'm better than you are. And they were destroying the church because of it. We don't have to know exactly what all of these teachers were teaching, but it is a constant reminder to us, and that's why it's in the New Testament. There is a constant reminder for us directly from the apostles that it's easy to get sidetracked or to make the gospel seem different to suit our own needs, to forget that Jesus is central to that, and to take the stuff of the church and turn it into a business in which we get wealthy. We've seen plenty of that happening, the health and wealth gospel, and the many ministers on different continents who have preached that and have gotten their huge sums of money and their jets and their fleet of cars and their mansions and all of that. If that's what the gospel is about, and if that's what happens to those who preach the gospel, it's just not right. And both Peter and Jude attest to that. There are a couple of strange things that Jude adds to what Peter has. He makes reference to two pieces of literature that we have from that time. One is the Assumption of Moses, and the other is the Book of Enoch. Now, Peter or Jude don't directly mention them, but they kind of quote or hint at them, Jude in particular. These books were popular. They were kind of like modern theological fantasies, each of which was quite similar, and both were quite similar to what we think of today as the Book of Mormon. That a long time ago, at a different period in the history of God's people, there were some warnings, there was some strife, there were some things that were happening, and somebody said, we better write these things down, and so they wrote them down, and then the manuscripts or the plates got hidden for centuries and centuries and centuries, and only recently had been discovered and recovered and translated, and now they're there. The Assumption of Moses pretended to be a record of the conversations between Moses and God as Moses went up Mount Nebo to his death, Deuteronomy 34, where Moses is at the end of his life and God takes care of him at the end. Can you imagine what the conversations must have been like? So the Assumption of Moses pretends to be those hidden conversations, and they talk a lot about times coming when there will be warfare and angels and demons and all of that, and that's what Jude picks up on. He says, you know, you're reading the literature and they're talking about angels and demons. Yeah, you got to take that stuff seriously. Not necessarily the Assumption of Moses, but you got to take that stuff seriously. Similarly, the Book of Enoch. In a very cryptic verse back in Genesis chapter 5, Enoch walked with God, and Enoch was not, for God took him. Just a little verse. But it says something about in a darkening age where people are becoming antagonistic to their Creator, Enoch was one of the people who did right, remembered God, remembered his Heavenly Father, prayed, and God appreciated that. And then something we kind of assume might have been sort of like Elijah going to heaven in the chariot of fire. Somehow God took Enoch into eternity without dying. We don't know because there's not enough information. But again, somebody wrote a book in between our Old and New Testaments and pretended to have uncovered the secret writings of Enoch. And again, it was about spiritual warfare and angels and demons and all of that. And again, Jude nods to that saying, hey, everybody's reading about these things. You should take that stuff seriously. Not Enoch and not this book, but the warnings about end times. And both Peter and Jude focus on those things. In any case, we need to keep reading 1 Peter because it talks to us about suffering and Jesus' encouragement through suffering. And God has taken care of things, but we need to remain faithful. And we have 2 Peter and Jude, both of which warn against false teachers and the way that they can mess things up in the church today. But let's also take a look at the book of Hebrews, which also is about suffering, and in an even bigger way. Now, the book of Hebrews is one of those books which is highly theological. We don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews. At the end, there are a few notes, those from Italy greet you, and it's obvious that those who are receiving this letter or this treatise, they know who the author is, but the author is never identified in the book. We'll talk more about that a bit later. One of the things that we do with the book of Hebrews is that we tend to jump around. We like reading chapter 1. In the past, God spoke through the prophets. In these latter days, he spoke through his son. We like to read the end of chapter 2, where we have a high priest who is like us, who can look after us. The end of chapter 4, same thing. He was like us in every respect except for without sin. A very powerful thing. He's divine and he's human. We like to jump over to chapter 10, where there's a lot of encouragement to continuing to be faithful. And that leads right into chapter 11, where we run the race, the marathon of faith, the heroes of faith. Powerful chapter. I'll never forget when my elementary school teacher pointed this chapter out to us and told us to write in our Bibles. And I didn't think we were supposed to write in our Bibles, but he told us to write on their heroes of faith. And I have read and reread the heroes of faith many times. The folks from the Old Testament who, in spite of different difficulties and sufferings, remain faithful to God and to the journey of faith. And that leads right to chapter 12, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher or perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising its shame, and suffered even to death. The whole idea that Jesus is the one who finishes our faith, and he's also the one who ran the race ahead of us. Then we get back into some instructions in chapter 12 and chapter 13, some of which we read quickly. Take care of strangers. Some have entertained angels by doing that. Keep the marriage bed undefiled, things like that. Good stuff. What we don't often do is that we skip over, or what we don't look at is we often skip over chapters about 5 through chapter 9. And that becomes the thing that we really need to understand in order to make this a reality. Something was going on in the church, and it happened particularly in the Jewish community. Obviously, the first Christians were all Jewish. The first Christians all believed that Jesus was the Messiah. The community that's being written to by this author of Hebrews is writing to Jewish Christians, and they know their Bibles well. The writer of Hebrews is probably the most intelligent, brainy writer in the New Testament. There's Luke, who writes the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, and then there's the writer of Hebrews, who is even more brainy than Luke, and Luke was very brainy. The writer of Hebrews knows the Old Testament in both the Greek and the Aramaic and Hebrew languages, and can quote much of it from memory, and so he does all the way through. But what we need to understand about the book of Hebrews is that it's written for a very specific reason. And that very specific reason is this: by the time the book is written, there was a growing distinction in the Roman thinking about Christians between Judaism that didn't hold to Jesus as Messiah and Jewish Christians who believed that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. And the Romans were very fastidious about something. They believed that wisdom was found in the ancients. We live in a world where only the new thing counts. Whatever is new is good. Whatever is old is obsolete or out of date. Not so the Romans. The Romans had an idea that the older was the wiser and the more true, and that what we needed to do was to get back to the old things. And here's where the Romans began to make a distinction between Jews generally, who had an ancient religion. It was an old religion, the ancient Israelites, the Hebrew prophets, all of that, and this new thing, this Christianity. Many of the Christians were Jews. Many of the Christians were not Jews. What the Christians were doing is they stopped serving in the military. They were, by and large, pacifists, and they refuse to practice emperor worship, and they refuse to participate in some of the cultural events of the times. And so increasingly, there was a distinction made between Judaism, which we don't necessarily like the Jews, but we can live with them, and they're an ancient people with an ancient religion, and the Christians, who are a new religion, and they're messing things up in our world. That's behind the book of Hebrews. And the people that the treatise, the letter, it's really a treatise more than a letter. There's no introductory stuff like to the saints of God and such, and here's the apostle speaking to you and all of that. And hey, how is George doing? And how's Fred getting along? And remember when we did this? None of that. It jumps right into teaching. What seems to be going on is that one community of Jewish Christians was beginning to slip away from the Christian faith. Why? Because if you were Jewish but didn't speak about Jesus, you got to keep your home, your job, your life, your family, and your possessions. Yay, I get this. On the other hand, if you were Christian and you talked about Jesus, you got to lose your possessions, your home, your family, your business, and your life. Yay, I get to lose everything. So here's what many Jewish Christians began to do. They said, you know, we didn't get into this to lose our lives. We got into this because we thought that we wanted to be faithful and complete in our religion. And some of the things that were going on was that they began, as they lived in Jewish communities, like in Rome, there was a large Jewish community, and it's very likely that this book is being written to the Jewish community in Rome, that eventually there were Jewish people who didn't believe in Jesus as the Messiah, and Jewish people who believed in Jesus as the Messiah, living together next door to one another and marrying into one another's families. And can you imagine a family where they're Jewish husband and wife, and the Jewish husband says, I believe in Jesus, and the Jewish wife says, well, my family doesn't think that way. And so they go to family gatherings and they begin to argue. And what they find out over time is that if he continues to say Jesus is Messiah, he gets to be executed, and the family is devastated. If he says, I'm Jewish, he gets to keep everything. This becomes the threat behind the book of Hebrews. Jewish Christians who have to make a choice whether they will be predominantly Jewish or predominantly Christian Jewish. Now, you may think, can't they be both? According to the Roman world, that wasn't the case. You couldn't be both at the same time. And so they had to choose, and this is where you get in Hebrews chapter 10, don't stop meeting with one another, as is the habit of some. Why wouldn't some meet with others? Sometimes people have used this to warn people to keep coming to worship services. That's not what this is about. Some of the Christian Jews stopped going to Christian worship services because they were Jewish and faithful and devout, but they didn't want to be caught with that crowd. What the writer of Hebrews does is something that is totally politically incorrect. He will go systematically through every value that Jewish people hold, and he will say that the outcome of this you can only tie to Jesus. Look at it from the beginning. God speaks through the prophets, so we should read the prophetic literature, yes indeed. But recently he's spoken through Jesus, his son. Oh, so we got to read Jesus too. How did that happen? Well, Jesus is even better than the angels. There's God, and there's the angels, and then there's us. And the angels mediate between God and Jesus. This man among us is better than the angels? And it goes right down the line. Jesus is better than Moses. Slap your face and stop blasphemy. Moses, he's the greatest of all Israelites, of all Jews ever. He's the one who received from God the Torah. Yeah, but it was the angels who mediated that, so the angels were better than Moses. But Jesus is the one who spoke to and through the angels. And Moses was the one who created the tabernacle. So Moses is great. But Moses was the manager, the housekeeper of the tabernacle. He was not the house owner. Jesus is the house owner. There was a whole priestly system, and we have to offer sacrifices. God said offer sacrifices. And here we get into something really, really astounding. We track through the Day of Atonement, Leviticus 16, and see how that was a yearly covenant renewal. And the writer of Hebrews will pick up on that. But then he throws a new name into the mix. He throws in the name of Melchizedek. Now, how did that happen? Where's Melchizedek from? Melchizedek? Who's Melchizedek? Melchizedek shows up in just a couple of verses in Genesis 14. Abraham has been away from his camp. He's probably gone into the big city to buy some stuff, do some trading. He comes back to the camp. Something's happened in the camp. What's happened in the camp? Raiders have come in, and they've taken away a bunch of the people, and they've stolen the livestock, and they've taken a bunch of the possessions. And Abram gets back to camp, and what happens? He's got to do something about this, so he goes chasing after them. And in Genesis chapter 13 and chapter 14, he makes battle with these raiders, and he wins, and he gets Lot back, and the rest of the family and the servants and all the possessions. And he's going back to his camp now. He's just, wow, what a heavy day, what a big day. And he stops for lunch, and they break out the meal, and they cook some meat, and guy wanders over from the nearby town. And he says, hey, you're traveling through. Yeah, our camp is down there. We're going home. What a day we've had. Tells him about the day and all that's taken place. And then Abram says to the guy, you know, I'm really grateful to God. God preserved us. God protected us. God saved my nephew Lot. And I'm so thankful to him. I just wish I could make a sacrifice to him. And the stranger says, well, what do you know? I'm actually the mayor of that town over there. It's called Salem, peace. You could call me king. Some of the people call me king over there. But I'm also the priest of the Most High God. Thank you, says Abram. Could you offer a sacrifice? We'll get ready. You go get your stuff. And he comes out, and Melchizedek is the guy. He offers the sacrifice for Abraham when Abraham is thankful. And Abram says, I'm so thankful. You take a tenth of all this stuff that we've recovered. You deserve it, and do with it what you will. Abraham pays the king and priest of Salem, a guy named Melchizedek, a tenth of everything. Abram goes home. And Melchizedek would be forgotten entirely. No one would ever remember Melchizedek, except then something else happened. David became king. Remember how we talked about David? The line of managers went from Moses to Joshua to the elders to the judges to the kings. And David was the second of those kings, and he said, you know, this isn't really quite right. You're supposed to be working directly with Yahweh, who's the true king of Israel. How have you made me king? And he knows that he's not from the tribe of Levi, so he's not technically part of Moses and Aaron's family, the people who should be leaders. How can he be the leader of God's people when he's not even from that family? And he thinks, there was another time when something happened. There was a guy named Melchizedek. And David writes a song, Psalm 110, and he says in his psalm, you have made me a priest after the order of Melchizedek. He talks about God using someone outside the system to give leadership to the system. And suddenly, generations later, those two very obscure references come together in something so astounding that chapters 7, 8, and 9, and even 10 are all about Jesus being after the order of Melchizedek. Now, There are all kinds of superstitious theologians who have built all kinds of crazy theories about the order of Melchizedek and some secret order someplace. It's none of that. The genius who wrote the book of Hebrews says this: you want to serve God. You are devout Jews. And all of the stuff that we have from our heritage is good stuff that helps us properly serve God. But I got to tell you, in these recent times, God did something nobody saw coming. God actually came and became all of those sacrifices, ceremonies, all of those rites and rituals, and God trumped everything in the person of Jesus. If you want to be a good Jew, you can't do so without Jesus. Whoa, you see what's going on here? Can Jewish Christians simply walk back to the Jewish community and stop mentioning Jesus? And the politically incorrect message of the book of Hebrews is no, because get this, you cannot be Jewish, authentically Jewish, without believing in Jesus, because Jesus is the culmination, the trump card, the big deal, the ultimate expression of everything Jewish. And he brings us out in a variety of ways. Jesus is better than Moses. Jesus is better than the angels. Jesus is better than the tabernacle, which is really his house. Jesus is better than the ceremonies. And get this, remember when Melchizedek officiated at the sacrifice at which Abraham said, you have to do this for me? Who was living inside of Abraham? Now you got to think this thing through, because you're not thinking. I would never have thought about this. I hope through our daughters and our grandchildren that there will be a number of other generations to come which will share the DNA that my wife and I passed along. There will be generations way down the road, hopefully, that will carry some of that DNA. You know where that DNA came from? Came from me and my wife. So technically, all of these descendants that I don't even know anything about, they are already in me, in my genetic material. And if I were to use something, technically they would make use of that thing too. So here, says the writer of Hebrews, is what happened. Even all of the priests who all offer the sacrifices that we think are so important, you know what? At one time in their forebear, and they weren't even around, and they weren't even thunk up yet, through their great-grandparent, Abraham, they made use of Melchizedek. And that's what Jesus is like. Someone outside the system who's bigger than the system. In fact, the system itself, get this, and he mentioned this several times, the system is like the shadow to the substance. Get that? Sunny day, sun comes out. I have a companion who always travels with me. Can't get rid of him no matter what. It's my shadow. My shadow goes with me wherever I go. If the sun is in the right position, my shadow even looks something like me, but he is not actually me. So what instead should we be thinking about? The real thing that brings the shadow into being is what we ought to focus on. Jesus is the real thing, and the shadow was always dependent on him. If you want to be truly, truly Jewish, you have to be truly, truly Christian. This is the argument and the rationale that goes all the way through. And that leads us to the end of chapter 10, the beginning of chapter 11, where all those people, you know what race they were running? The race toward Jesus. And steps out, slowly, slowly picking up speed. Now, I was a runner in high school. I ran track. I ran cross country, 3-5 miles. Longest I ever ran was 10 miles at a time. Thankfully, I've gotten wiser and I don't do all of that silly stuff anymore. I'm no longer a distance runner. But when you're running a distance, the first short ways is energetic. I've got so many carbs in me, I can run this thing. And about a mile down the road, or maybe even before that, reality hits. I can't run this race. I can't run this race. It's never going to happen. And so what happens is your mind disconnects from your body, and your body keeps running without your mind. You go numb. And your body just continues on. And finally, you get close to the end of the race, and suddenly there are more crowds around, and they're cheering people on. And then you have to run that last steep uphill to the stadium, and you can hear the noise of the crowd from the stadium. And then you have to run into the entrance at the bottom of the stadium under the seats and bleachers. And you run there to the gate that goes into the stadium itself, into the arena. And then you have to make one last lap around the arena before you get to the place where there's the finishing line. And the noise is astounding when you break out into the arena. And you look around and you see all of these people, and you see people you didn't even know were going to be there. You see your parents and your grandparents, and your grandparents aren't even alive anymore, but here they are. They came to see this race. And you see your uncles and aunts, and you didn't even know they knew about this. And you see your cousins and your third cousins and your fifth cousins, and you didn't even know you knew your fifth cousins. And you see people that died and went on to glory before, pastors and teachers from the past. People that you've read about in history books. You can see folks up there like John Calvin and Martin Luther, and you go back even further, Augustine, and then you see Peter and James and John. You didn't even know you knew them, but you know them, and they know you, and they're cheering you on with your own name. They're cheering you on, and they're saying, "Go for it, you can do this." And you keep going all the way around. You see David, and you see Solomon, and you see Moses himself standing out there cheering you on. And you get around that last corner and you look toward the finish line. What do you see? It's Jesus. You see Jesus. And he points to you and he says, "You can do it. You can do it. I know you can do it." And you run, and you've got a lift in your feet, and you're flying on wings of faith, and you get across that line. And you fall into the arms of Jesus. That's what the writer of Hebrews says. Then he gives a couple more instructions. You know, there are two mountains, he says. There's Mount Sinai. God thundered and the people were scared. And there's Mount Zion, where God speaks and the angels lift you, and they support you, and they bring you home. We are not like those who stood trembling at Mount Sinai. We are those who stand in the very presence of God, and we are lifted on angels' wings to be with God himself. Now, don't get me wrong, folks. You're going to suffer, and you're going to die. Look around you. 2 out of 3 of you are going to be dead in the next 5 years. Yes, you are Jews. But you believe in Jesus because to be truly Jewish means you have to believe in Jesus, for he is what Judaism is all about. You cannot be truly Jewish unless you believe in Jesus. And when that happens, you're going to suffer. And you're going to die. And you're going to be received into glory. Because Jesus ran the race first. Keep going, folks. It's not going to be easy, but it's going to be beautiful. And so strengthen those with weak hands and lift up those with weak knees and stand next to one another. You can do it because Jesus did it, and Jesus lives in you. Who wrote this brilliant book? I called it that, one of the books I wrote. The brilliant, inspiring, and tragic message of Hebrews. Yeah. Who wrote it? Different people have speculated. In our New Testaments, it's placed right next to the writings of Paul. Some have thought, tried to say along the way that it was Paul. Probably not Paul's writing. It's just, the wording is too different. It's not the same person. Some have suggested Luke. Some have suggested Barnabas. Some have even suggested Priscilla, of Priscilla and Aquila. And maybe this is a book that was written by one of a female. I personally, and I can't make this true for anybody, but I personally think here's where Apollos shows up in our New Testaments. Remember Apollos? He was that gifted philosopher, theologian who came to Ephesus, and Paul trained him in the ways of Jesus, and he was so brilliant, and everybody loved his preaching, and they all said, when's Apollos going to come? I think this book was written by Apollos, but you can't make a dime on that. There's no putting that one in the bank. It's a possibility, and you take from it what you will. But we have 4 books here, and they're truly about suffering and struggles in the church. And the most brilliant of them all, I've got to say, the one that I have struggled with, but I have come to love so passionately, is the book of Hebrews. Truly a martyr's manual. Anyway, that's it for this time. What questions do you have? What are your thoughts?